Remember all the premiers when they were shutting down the joint, when they were resisting any efforts over recent weeks to relax restrictions? They've always handballed the hard decisions away. They've always passed the buck. Don't question me, they've said. It's the medical advice. Shutting down schools, closing state borders, keeping pubs and restaurants shut. They've always deferred to the medical advice, even when medical advice from the National Chief Medical Officer was different. It's always been a bit of a nonsense, of course. It's always been a way of hiding from accountability. Because with the coronavirus pandemic in our midst, the clear medical advice to minimise your risk of infection is to stay home, isolate all the time. The issue has always been about balancing interests, balancing risk against practicality, health system against the economy, and minimising infections against paralysing society. Over the past few days, the state and territory leaders have had their spinelessness exposed. It's now been laid bare how this was never just about following the medical advice. Because all the medical advice says don't gather in crowds. We're banned from gathering in crowds at sport, in the park, at the beach, but governments let these protests happen in Sydney and Perth. They were too scared to step in and impose the medical advice, preventing protesters from gathering. And in the nation's capital this morning, again, we saw protesters gathering in big numbers in a way that's illegal for sporting groups, religious groups, people putting on a wedding or other gatherings. But it was OK for these protesters. The health advice was ignored, not to mention the law. So it was OK for state governments to send your kids home from school. It was OK for them to kick you off the beach or out of the park. It was OK for them to force you to celebrate Anzac Day this way. No dawn service, no march, just street-side vigils. It was OK for them to ban people from funerals. They're still keeping numbers down at funerals and weddings. There are still 4 states in the territory that won't let us cross their borders. Yet they were all going to step back and watch and let protests happen in all of our capital cities tomorrow. Protests linked to the American racial strife after the killing of George Floyd and seeking to highlight Indigenous issues here. State leaders who say they only follow medical advice started off by ignoring that advice. They were too timid to demand of the protesters what they demand of all of us. And then the backlash. Many of you shared my editorial last night. Many others rang talkback radio and commented and complained online. And the politicians now have been scrambling to catch up. Most have now deferred the decision not to the medical advice now, but to the police. In Victoria, the police say they'll only issue fines to the organisers of the protests if social distancing rules are broken tomorrow. In New South Wales, the police are going to the Supreme Court to try to have tomorrow's march and protest banned. That court proceeding is unfolding as we speak. In South Australia, police have given protesters an exemption from the rules. The politicians didn't defer to the police for all the rest of us. They just banned certain activities and they demanded that the police enforce the law. Politicians panicked about crowds at Bondi Beach and at St Kilda, but they get wobbly at the knees when it comes to protesters. It just shows how mainstream people are so often ignored by politicians in favour of the squeaky wheels, the activists and the agitators. Look, it's pretty simple. There is one law and it should apply to all of us. If crowds are out, then the protests should not be allowed to go ahead. If you want the medical advice, here it is.
If you had, let's say, 50 unrelated people who got infected at a mass gathering and you had 50 outbreaks like centimetres, each with 100 people involved, you can imagine that over a period of weeks you could get a very significant community transmission event. Obviously that's a worst case scenario, but it is certainly possible.
But go ahead. Don't go to the footy. Don't collect your friends together for a wedding, but have a protest in the tens of thousands. Now, on the other hand, and perhaps more to the point, if state governments now decide crowds are OK and can be managed easily enough after all, then the rest of us should be able to go to the footy, have a big wedding in the park or go to a concert. It has to be one or the other. We are all equal under the law. There can't be one rule for the mainstream Australians and another for protesters. I'd protest against that.